Welcome to Elevating Consciousness, the podcast that helps you discover deeper levels of truth, meaning, and wholeness. I'm your host, Artem, and our guest today is a master storyteller, a cultural activist, and former palliative care worker. He's the author of countless books, including most recently Reckoning, as well as Generations Worth, Spirit Work While the Crisis Reigns, and the award-winning Die Wise. He's also the co-founder of the Nights of Grief and Mystery, a musical storytelling ceremony, along with Canadian singer-songwriter Gregory Hoskins. What started as an improvisational collaboration has led to an international tour and the release of several records, with the two most recent being Dark Roads and Rough Gods. Stephen Jenkinson, welcome to the show.
Thank you. I feel welcomed already.
Beautiful. Yeah, so I guess we'll start with how are you, because that seemed to be a loaded question.
Well, I'm on the road again. God, I just got off the road a week ago, but I'm here again. So it's questionable motel rooms in questionable parts of town with questionable, who knows how long it's been around, breakfast stuff. And I'm trying to get ready for the gig tomorrow night. And I'm in another country, and I'm just vaguely delirious, but cogent enough to be with you.
So this is your second time on the show, and in our first conversation, which I will link in the show notes, we mostly spoke about death and dying wise. And I still have more questions about death, and probably infinite amount of questions, and maybe we could address a couple at the end.
Sure.
But first, I really want to talk to you about your band, the Nights of Grief and Mystery, and maybe the origins of your passion for storytelling. You seem to have inexhaustible ability to reinvent yourself and play any role that life asks of you. Yet, from my perspective, it seems that the central thread in your life is your remarkable ability for storytelling and meaning making. And I've read on your site that you apprenticed to a master storyteller as a young man. And I'd love to hear about what that experience was like, and who this guy was, and how that really helped to mold you into the prolific storyteller you are today.
Well, very kind words. Thank you. There's always a preamble to the amble, or at least there should be. So the story always begins before you start telling it. You kind of jump in the middle of the river and pretend it's the source, So in this case, I think, I can get to the apprenticeship in a second, but to be fair to all of us, I'm fairly sure I don't have any direct corroboration on the matter, because everybody who was there at the time is dead now. But I think probably from the womb, I was read to. I certainly was read to from a very, very young age, on this side of the threshold. And that's had an immense consequence. I remember, for example, my mother bringing me to a drive-in movie back in the day, drive-in movies. And it was Gone with the Wind, which was friggin' long by any estimation. And I would have been 6, maybe, something like this. And of course, she's counting on being able to watch a movie because I'm conked out in the seat beside her. And as she told the story to me many years later, I was, my chin on the dashboard there, watched the whole thing without even blinking. And it was long, and it was taxing, and all the rest. I figure, if that's a true story, I think it was. I have a vague memory of it. It comes from what she did, 4 or 5 years before that. And there's something, I'm not saying I remember any of the stories she told, of course I don't. But I remember 2 things. I remember something about her telling them. And I remember there's a certain cadence that people begin to adopt when they're storytelling. It's not information. And God knows it's not argument. It's not philosophizing. It's not hypothesizing. It's not arguing. It's there's something else. It's everything about it is different. Probably the set of the jaw is different when you're doing it. Certainly your solar plexus is different. Your breathing patterns are different. And that's what she did. And she must have done it for years and years. So that has stayed with me as a kind of imprint, to the point where I think the way the world comes at me is it's telling itself. And in that sense, maybe my take on the fundaments of life might be a little different in the sense that they're very old. Not old in my own lifetime old, but old, generationally, ancestrally old. I think I've been exposed to a kind of way of being human that's so fundamentally out of fashion now that it's not clear that it's coming back, certainly not in my lifetime. Because storytelling takes a certain degree of patience on the hearing end, number one. And number two, the best storytellers begin with something like this. I don't know anything, but I heard this once. Or you start telling a story very badly, and then a gifted storyteller can't stand it anymore, and finally will gently or otherwise introduce him or herself into the proceedings to get the story more faithfully told, you could say. And in which case, the people who are telling the story badly look at each other very conspiratorially and give themselves the thumbs up because they got the old person rolling, you see. So that's the preamble. That's the way life sounds to me. It sounds like a horse with four hooves, rolling over itself and then landing, but asymmetrically. And then years go by. I'm accepted to Harvard Divinity School, which is just a laughable arrangement because the marks weren't the best coming out of university. And then I didn't have the money, but somehow they gave me a scholarship. And then I thought I wanted to go into the priesthood, but I'd never been to church in my life. And so I actually literally did not know what I was talking about. So when they came for the kind of screening interviews, to determine the suitability of your vocation, because it's a big deal, right? You're going to be a proto-priest by the time you're done here in 2 years' time. And I didn't survive the first 3 questions of the interview because I didn't have a sponsoring congregation. I still remember it. I didn't have a denominational affiliation, didn't have a sponsoring congregation, and I'd never been to church. The guy just looked at me and he said, "What are you doing here?" And I said to him, I reiterated, I said, I wanted to be go into the clergy in some fashion. He said, "You want to go into the priesthood of something or other," he said. I said, "Yeah, that's about it." And so anyway, needless to say, they didn't take me. So I ended up in the academic side of the study, not the devotional side, which turned out to suit me very, very well indeed, and spared a lot of church types a lot of trouble in having to deal with me. And in the same week that happened at Harvard Divinity School in Cambridge, Massachusetts, I went to one of those meet the faculty events that kick off the year in the fall. And somebody came over to me and said, "You got to come and meet this guy." And already I'm a little disillusioned, disenchanted, it's not working out. I'm far from home and so on. And there's this tall, lanky black man of indeterminate age. It's clear he wasn't 40, but he could have been 90, somewheres in between. And he was phosphorescent. That's the best way to describe him. He was beyond electric. He was crackling with a kind of dynamism and lack of jitteriness about what he was doing in this world. And I'd never seen the likes of it in a human form in my life. I didn't know such a thing existed. And he was just talking. But the manner of his presence was, he wouldn't appreciate this, but he's dead now, so he can't correct me. It was a biblical kind of moment. The kind of thing you think, if it ever existed, was so long ago, it couldn't possibly exist now. And there it was, right in front of me. And I was probably like everybody else there. I was just what they call gate mouthed, just your jaw swinging on a hinge. You don't know what to say. And at some point he looked at me and he said, "You should come to my class." By this time I realized that he was in the devotional side of things, right? In the what they call the hortatory arts, the arts of argument and preaching and so forth. I said, "Well, they counseled me out of this already, so I don't qualify." He leaned over and he said, "Son," he said, "I'm the teacher. If I tell you you're qualified, Harvard Divinity School or otherwise, you are qualified," he said. So I'm thinking, man, and he turns the place upside down to boot. So anyway, I went to the first meeting. I wasn't supposed to go, but I did. And I don't know what possessed me, but on the way out on the dresser, there was a few harmonicas that I had with me. And I picked up one and put it in my pocket. I have no idea why to this day. I walked in to the chapel of the Divinity School, which is where his classroom was. He was already in full flight. He was, quote, storytelling. And, I'm a very shy person. And I don't know why I took that harmonica out of my pocket, but I did. And to the best of my abilities, which were meager at the time, I attempted to accompany him or echo him or in some other fashion, augment what he was doing. And I don't know how much kind of spicy language we can get away with here, but I'll tell you, he looked at me in mid-flight, didn't even break a beat, didn't break a sweat, nothing. But he looked at me, and his look said two things at the same time. First one was, who the you think you are? That was the first one. And the second is if you got the stones to do this, you better not stop now. So he was in a strange way daring me to continue. That was the very first encounter. He called me midweek. His wife did, asked me if I wanted to do a church service with him. Now, don't forget, I'd never been to church. So for me, church services are like hallowed things, So you don't mess with it, and you certainly don't do it as an outsider. But, and that's what I said. She said, no, he's very persuaded that, that you can do it. I said, well, so what should I bring? Oh, just bring what you brought. A harmonica in a church. She said, absolutely, yeah. I said, is there anything I should read? Is there anything I should know? She said, just a sec. And she was off talking to him. She come back and she said, Blue says to read the Good Samaritan. So apparently I was going to do the Good Samaritan on a harmonica in a church in Danvers, Massachusetts. And that's how this aspect of my life probably started. So uncertain and just literally, as I said, almost biblically, just plucked from my ordinary life and placed here beside him and dared to proceed. It's not a bad beginning. That was the very early days of what turned into an undeclared apprenticeship with somebody who is a master of the masters of the art. And so I sit here today in Boise, Idaho, in a bad hotel, talking to you about it. It directly comes from those days.
Yeah, that's beautiful. And I think you said Blue. So was this brother Blue? Was this?
Yes, sir.
Man? Yeah. I don't know how I ran across his stuff, but I've been reading a little bit about him. And I think I put the two and two together. I know on one of your albums, there's also a song that's called Harvard Square.
That's right.
That's where he used to perform. And I was actually just reading a whole thing about him on the Harvard Square website. They were like honoring him. He would always perform there. And that's quite remarkable that you got to meet somebody like that. And it definitely something translated because you are a very prolific storyteller. And it almost seems like you have an endless amount of stories and you have a story for any occasion, any and every occasion. And the consequence of meeting somebody like this is that they steal a lot of things from you. Now, it doesn't seem that way at the time, but I came to realize that, I was fairly young in my understanding of life at the time. And my characterization of it is that I was slouching on the threshold of personhood or adulthood anyway, and no inclination to walk through the door. I mean, it's not uncommon for people of my age at the time, and it's not uncommon today either. And this guy came along, and what he stole from me was my ability to slouch there and gripe and complain and moan because, quote, I'd never seen the real thing. See, so I had no reason to try to outgrow my life up until that time because I had no example. So I had all the excuses. I'm not saying I said any of this stuff out loud to myself, but I realized that certainly was the posture that I had taken. And then I met the real thing. And then all my excuses were gone, you see. And it didn't turn me into a better person.
certainly not. But it did dare me to, minus any kind of formal initiation as being 13 or 15 or whatever it was, minus that, he kind of took me aside. And for the next 7 years, he saw to it that everything that he was capable of somehow flashed by me. He didn't keep anything to himself, really. But there was no instruction. I should really say that. I mean, there was performance, and then there was the time in between the performance, and there was traveling to the gigs. And I traveled with him and his wife quite a bit, Ruth, who's still alive, and she's still working, I believe, with Radcliffe College down there. And it was just a wondrous thing, and it's if I ever run out of gratitude because I'm dispirited or dissatisfied at some point in my life, and I have the good sense just to try to remember things, then those 7 years off and on are reason enough for me to outgrow whatever melancholy has come to catch me. Even at the age of 68, which I am now, I'm still an apprentice to that experience and that example.
Yeah, what strikes me is there's a couple of things you said, but you said the real thing, and then how that kind of impacted you into like growing up. So I'm wondering what you mean by the real thing.
Mm. Well, the real thing is not always good in the sense of encouraging or friendly or easy on you. Quite the contrary. The real thing comes from somewhere, and it's a learning devoted event, meeting the real thing. It's not a knowledge-based thing. It's a learning-based thing. Learning's insanely expensive, because you start learning stuff about what you think you know, and pretty soon most of what you know doesn't survive. And you're a young person besides, you're in another country. You're at Harvard, you're supposed to be relatively smart, right, to get in the first place. And here's this guy who doesn't say anything to you. Basically doesn't say anything to you. And his authenticity was blistering at times because he was never off. There was no performance blue and then street corner blue and then, at home with a cup of tea blue. I mean, if there was anyone around, he was that guy. And if there's nobody around but him and his almighty and his ancestry, he was that guy. We should also mention he was a black man, and he came to age, in your country in a rather challenging time, right? It's not for me to describe it in any kind of detail, but he had his luminaries, he had his heroes, and Malcolm X was one of them. He'd often talk about him. And Miles Davis was another one. He'd often talk about him. And frankly, anybody who stuck it to the system was his guy, And this were radicalizing times. So it was dangerous, obviously, to be a young black man in those days. And it may be no less dangerous now, I don't know. But I used to travel with him to places I would never have survived going to if I wasn't with him. And we would travel places that he would never have survived in if he had not been with me. It was a stunning thing that, I knew I was with somebody who could, after his fashion, change the world. I don't mean at some huge scale, but locally speaking, he could literally change how things went by his consequence. And this generated an enormous amount of hostility in certain places to go along with the awe that people like me had. Yeah. So this is what I mean by biblical. In the same moment, there were people who wanted to conceive babies with him and people who wanted to murder him in the same moment. If that's not real, I don't know what real is.
Yeah. Getting that sense of authenticity and also that sense of intensity that comes along with it. We're not used to that. Somebody always being just in that kind of space, not pretending to be somebody, not putting on a mask to match the personality in front of them.
Mm-mm. No, he would, this guy could inhale the energy in the room, and he got to the point where, he would understand if I said this. that you would, after a fashion, you'd hate the guy. Why? Because his example was so capable that your example looked very paltry by comparison. So even though he did nothing to warrant these mixed feelings that you'd have about him, you had them nonetheless, right? Because you could never look adequate or achieved around him, because his standard for being a human being was so remarkably high and demanding. But he never held you to it. I mean, I should say it again. This is all coming from me, what you're hearing, no? He didn't impose any of this stuff. He was just like a mountain, right? And if you feel intimidated by the mountain, it's not the mountain's fault. Yeah.
Yeah, very, very inspiring. You've weaved your storytelling into public speaking, into documentaries, countless books, and most recently into this live performance band. Can you share the story of how Nights of Grief and Mystery came to be?
Oh boy. I think I've told you 3/4 of how it happened, just with what we've talked about so far, yeah? But I can make the link too, I think. So we're doing that work for 7 years. And now I had no idea what a storyteller was. I thought it was a children's entertainer, man. I thought, I had that little ghetto in my mind, entertaining balloons, right? You know what I'm saying? Trivial in some fashion, something you'd grow out of eventually. Jesus, what I knew. Anyhow, so I had this 7 years down the road, because of visas and citizenship and all that stuff, that I couldn't really be there any longer. So I had to leave and come back to Canada, which I did. And time goes by, and your life begins to take its current shape, and you sort of recognize that, you realize sometime after the fact that that's probably the last time that's going to happen that way. Then you meet somebody, and then marriage begins to look like an option, and then kids thereafter, and trying to make the normal life work, you see. But here's the thing, I'm haunted by what I saw, and I can't find a way to translate what I saw in those 7 years as a young guy into what a life in the trenches should look like. And so I'm genuinely haunted because I just can't translate it. And so my characterization is, it was 10 years in the wilderness, 10 years in which I tried to do the right thing, you see. And his example was so hard on an unexamined life that I had to try to leave it behind, which was heartbreaking. Yeah, it's like trying to leave behind another father. Yeah, it was very much like that. And eventually I got into the death trade somehow, and still, all the whole while that I'm doing the work I'm doing, I'm informed by everything that I saw, but I'm heartbroken at the same time because I can't find a way to make it present. It all seems to be in the past. It all seems to be gone, It's just, like I said, haunted by it instead of informed and nourished by it. And then certain things went haywire because I was calling down the mighty in the death trade, and did that film Grief Walker, and shortly thereafter the book did Die Wise. And I had nothing because I was excommunicated from the Citadel, right? For wondering about it. And that's when it started. When I had nothing, when I was more than 10 years in the desert, when the first marriage didn't work anymore, and I couldn't find a way to embody what I had been blessed to be able to see. You get the feeling, right? I hope you do. In hindsight, it looks like a wondrous tale. But I tell you this, when I was living it, it was very much the contrary. It was mostly heartbreak and a lot of confusion. And so I got nothing going on. I got no prospects. I'm 53 years old. Okay, I got an ex-wife and some kids. Were trying to figure out how to do that thing. And that's when it began. And everything that may have drawn me to your attention came from those days, not from before, okay? So that's the preamble to Nights of Grief and Mystery. And somewhere in there, somebody gets in touch with me who I don't know, says to me, he'd like to come to me and talk to me about songwriting. I say, I don't know anything about songwriting. I mean, you got the wrong guy. He said, no, he said, I've read stuff that you've done and I've heard you talk. He said, you understand songwriting. I said, look, you're probably a bad judge of character, but you're insisting. So I'm not going to change your mind. So if you want to come and talk about it, so be it. You'll probably do most of the talking. He came over and he didn't do most of the talking. It was 6 hours of probably me doing most of the talking, though I don't remember now what I said. And on his way out, he left me a CD. Now, I get a lot of CDs, you know, a lot of books and stuff. And I hope this sounds kind, but most of them aren't too good. They're just not. They're self-produced, you know what I mean, and all the rest. And they're certainly worth the trouble for the people who did it. But my life's only so long, you know. So anyway, so the CD was there, and I'm looking at it, and I don't want, because I had a fond encounter with the guy. I don't want to blow it by listening to his bad music, you know, folk music, whatever it was going to be. So I don't know, it was maybe 2 weeks later, and I was idly talking on the phone, and this thing was there, still in the shrink wrap. So I took my thumbnail, cut the shrink wrap, took this CD out, and I just got off the phone, hung it up, and I got a little, you know, really bad little boom box right there. And I just put it on, and I pressed play, really idly, right? Basically to cross it off the list. The first notes I heard stopped me. And then it was a chorus that he was singing over an orchestra. It was a live recording over an orchestral thing. And I was listening. And it said, I'm going to take a little walk through these fields. I'm going to carry me gently so my heart can heal. I'm going to find me a demon in a dark, dark wood. You can't come with me. I wish you could. That's how that shit started. And I was just frozen. I was listening. I mean, the poetic evocation of all the work that I'd done in the death trade was right there in front of me. That's exactly what sitting with dying people sounds like, feels like, and that's what it does to you. So I opened the email to write this guy to say, you know, dude, I had no idea you were with the program, or you knew what you knew. Meanwhile, he has sent me a thank you note for the time, right? And as God is my witness, this is what the PS said. He said, if you're ever looking for a band, I know this guy. Yeah. That's how it started.
Yeah, that's a moving story. And I'm just wondering how did you proceed from there? Like, how did the conversation unfold? Where it's like, oh, let's actually meet up. Let's see how we can put us together. What proceeded after that? Yeah,
it was nothing like that, because that sounds like you're kind of in control. You know what you're doing. This was us falling over something, not picking it up and carrying it along. So I think the next thing that probably happened was, it was in the same week. So you can't make this stuff up. I got a call from a charitable foundation in the United States somewhere. They said, really like what you're doing. Thanks a lot. Want your work to be more well-known in this country? Oh, great. So we want to give you a grant so you can travel around or you use it as you see fit, but we just want you to be better known in the United States. Really? I said. So how do I get the money? They said, well, you got to apply for it. I said, but you just said that you thought I was a good idea. Why do I got to apply for it? This is your idea. And they said, well, it's just the way it goes. You got to jump through the hoops. I said, I'm not a hoop jumping guy. So I turned a bit of a dick about it, but not too bad. He said, anyway, you got to be, what do they call that? Nonprofit. And I said, I'm definitely not nonprofit. That's for sure. I'm profit where possible. That's my arrangement. So it turned out that the publisher of DieWise was a nonprofit organization. And so I just hooked the two of them up. And the publisher agreed to underwrite the application as a nonprofit and in after fashion be the recipient of the money that would in turn send it to me. So here's this money, not a fortune, but as best I recollect it, somewhere's maybe 8 or 10,000 or something like that. And here I got this guy saying, if you're ever looking for a band. And so I just put the two of them together. And I wrote him and I said, I got this money. We could travel. It's got to be in the States. You ever toured before? I don't know what I'm talking about, but suddenly this thing has presented itself. He wrote back one word, in, he said. Okay, so that's the next stage, right? And then what are we going to actually do though? Well, don't forget, he's already seen me in action. So he's figured that there's something there that somehow would work with what he does. Because he'd been a touring musician for, 25, 30 years by that time. So I'm basically trusting him. So the very first gig we did was in a recital hall in New York City, right? Sold out. And we got no set list because we got no set. And we got no plan. And we don't know what we're going to do. And basically he just says, I'll watch you really carefully. And I'll do more than accompany you. We'll see how it goes. Just don't stop. And, 100 minutes later, to a standing ovation, we looked at each other like, what was that? And we had to get on the plane and fly to Austin, Texas the next day and try to do it again. And certain kind of momentum that was really based on a very high mutual regard. I had a very strong, impression of his musical ability and his artistic sentiment. And whatever he had about me, you'll have to ask him. But somehow the two of them found their way together and never doubted it. And that was 7 years ago, I guess. And I mean, you think things couldn't get more mythic or sort of storytelling-ish than that. Well, they certainly can, and they have. But that's kind of how we moved. We just didn't say no. There's a lot of mechanics involved too. And eventually you do rehearse and you do have a shared understanding of what you're up to. And eventually you realize that you're not giving the tickets away. You're asking people to pay their money. So then you want to put together a proper show that turns out not to be a show for distraction or encouragement or hope mongering. You want to do a show where grown-ups can recognize the troubles of their times in front of them, not inside them. That's kind of how it went. And eventually we put together a band, if you can imagine all of this, to a kind of rhythm and blues sensibility. The music is not all rhythm and blues, but if I were to characterize it as a kind of a genre of a sort, you would say it's a rhythm and blues storytelling something. Which is a very old form, because it's a combination of lament and praise and prayer and thanksgiving and dumbfoundedness and making sure the mystery's intact at the end of the night. Hence the name, Nights of Grief and Mystery.
Yeah, so when you say that the mystery's intact, it's you kind of what you're doing is you're shaking people's certainty. You're shaking people out of the funk or the certainty of, I know what life's about. I know what all this is. Is that what you mean when you say that, making sure the mystery is intact?
Yeah, partly, but also doing something about their certainty around their depression. Don't forget, depression is as sure of itself as arrogance is, isn't it? Depression's not going anywhere. It's not saying, I have no idea about myself. No, depression is all about, I got this very figured out, Excuse me, I got to get something to drink here. I'm getting dry.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that and what you're saying, it kind of, for me, the way I see it is when you talk about hope and hopelessness, you know what I'm saying? They're both like yes and no. It's just very black and white, very certain. And when you talk about hope free, to me, that's like the middle path.
Yeah. I don't, that's very kind of you to observe that. I don't think myself that it's the middle path. I don't think it's a place between hopeful and hopeless. That space between those two things is still all informed by this hope project. And you're just swinging away from one or away from the other on some kind of awful pendulum over the years, right? And what I'm trying to manifest is an understanding that you simply don't need hope to proceed, but you do have to proceed. I mean, you and I were both born into a time of extraordinary trouble, and it's not getting better. Since the last time you and I spoke, just about everything you want to talk about is worse than it was. And I mean, the worst thing that's happening now is this fantasy that we're somehow on the other side of the COVID-19 thing. Well, we're not on the other side of anything. Just because nobody's wearing a face rag anymore doesn't mean something's fundamentally otherwise. It means everything you got a chance to see when the chips were down and the shit hit the fan. Are you still seeing it? Are you still mobilized by it? Are you still willing? I'm not talking about, your feelings about friggin', what do you call it?
Vaccines.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm not talking about that stuff. I'm talking what you saw about yourself. I'm talking about what you were willing to settle for. Way back in the glory days of when everything was normal in 2019. Wait a second. You mean to tell me 2019 is the high water mark of what we're capable of as a culture? And that's what you want to get back to when you want to get back to normal? God damn it, man. Okay, so Nights of Grief and Mystery is possessed of the understanding that there's no likelihood that things are going to get better simply because time is moving on, right? Humans can get used to almost any misery, any damage. Isn't it true? We can put up our tent on a slag mountain, right? Outside of a mine. We can live in the love canal, full of pestilence and radiation. I mean, this shit is just true. It's diabolically true. So if you have any, let's call it artistic responsibility to the culture that you were born to, and I think I do, then you have to translate whatever you're capable of into something that calls out to the people. Okay, that's what it does. Is something like you rekindle the memory of water when people have grown accustomed to their thirst. It's that kind of thing. And so you're doing work that nobody's asking you to do until you've done it. And then they thank you for doing it, but they never imagined it was either necessary or useful or possible before you did it. So you're almost setting your own example, and then the mystery that happens between you and the people who come somehow begins to move in a certain direction if everything's working, if people are keeping some kind of good faith, some basic mutually shared understanding that shit doesn't have to be like this. It doesn't have to be this bad, but it's probably going to get worse because this way of life doesn't end by itself. It just doesn't. It's another kind of living thing. And like all living things, it clings to its life. So our current social and political regime is not going anywhere by itself. They're still making their 5-year plans. You know that. Okay, so how's anything going to be different so that if you have kids, that somehow this notion of that all you've got is hopeful or hopeless can somehow be different? Well, you don't play maybe, because here's what I figure, and then I'll turn over for your next question. So I just turned 68 in the summertime. Now you're supposed to cool out by 68, largely because you can't, because you flame out, right? Because you can't keep the fire burning. So that's not working out for me. I didn't get the memo about cooling out. So it hasn't happened yet. When it happens, it'll probably be drastic and it probably won't be my choice. But between now and then, I'm thinking that my responsibility was to get myself ready for the oncomingness of people your age and younger than you, the generation younger than you. And let's say, a handful of them at any given time seek me out, which has certainly begun to happen in the last 10 or 15 years. And I know what's coming. Inside of all the things they want to ask me about their own personal lives and direction and all this kind of thing, there's one question that just is there all the time, whether they ask it or whether they don't. And this is what it is. when you were my age, did you know what was happening? And you know what the answer they want to hear from my mouth? No. They want to hear no. Why? Well, because between when I was their age and now, everything's got worse. I mean, but crazy worse. And if I knew what was happening and it got worse, what do I look like to them? So they want to hear me say no, didn't know, had no way of knowing. And all this shit went down, not on my watch though, and sorry about that, but hey, what are you going to do? Kind of thing. The shrug. But if the answer is yes, we knew enough to know that it shouldn't be like this anymore. And we knew enough to know what the consequences were going to be for your generation. That's very hard to live with, because the first instinct is going to be what? They're going to turn away from my generation. Well, that's not hypothetical. That's on, right? What's the second question? Based on the first, the second question is, so what'd you do? I'm answering the question by how I'm living. So I don't have to make it up when they ask. And that's what Nights in Grief and Mystery also is. My answer to kids who are 18 years old about what did you do? What did you know? Kind of thing.
Yeah, it's powerful. I'm picking up on some kind of noise. I think
Yes.
it's friend.
Just at the end of what I was saying, there's a little fan, I think, in my computer, and it just went off. And it's still sort of whirring and buzzing. And I don't know what to do about it.
Yeah, we're gonna roll with it, and I wonder if that's you were talking about your fire still not burning out, the heat is picking up, and your computer can't handle it.
So it seems.
Yeah, so we'll just roll with it, and hopefully when I get it edited, we'll be able to remove it.
Okay.
Yeah, no worries. So you did mention that when you're working with Gregory, and you guys would just keep saying yes. And the yes is like, that's a very known thing in improv. You just say yes, and that's how you're able to keep moving forward. It seems like a lot of the stuff that you did, it was like kind of improv material. I'm wondering, has that process changed, and have you done actually records where you sat down together and mapped things out, or put like two of you together and worked on something like more premeditated, I guess I would say.
Yeah. Well, I mean, when you sit down to do something that requires a degree of technology and recording and capture and things of this kind, you obviously have some kind of scheme. It may not be very developed. And the next thing is you got an idea, but you're not doing this by yourself. So you're not bouncing against yourself and your former limitations and all that sort of thing. You're bearing them in mind, but you're bringing them to the partnership. Right? And the partnership is a thing that exists separate of the two of you who make up the partnership. There's another entity there, right? And that entity you're trying to take care of, not milk it, but actually try to take care of it. Yeah. So, I mean, we did a record at the same time that the virus was coming on there in March of 2020. We had a 70-city tour lined up, 70 on 4 continents. It was getting big. It was clicking. And he came down to Mexico, where I was, to work on something, and it wasn't really a set. It was more like an iteration of things that had occurred to us while we had been touring in 2019 that we just couldn't work into the show because they were too new and too raw, and we already had something going on. So they turned into 2 records, 1 live record and 1 studio record. And we came out of that isolation, that creative isolation, turned on the radio for the first time in 2 weeks and heard about this thing, this coronavirus thing. Had no clue whatsoever that any of this was going on. And then we looked at what we had just crafted, what I'd written down, some of the musical sensibility that was gathering around it. And that record's called Rough Gods. And man, it was like somehow, I'm not saying we knew, but somehow what was happening in the world was coming right through us and turned into a number of pieces. And there's a very strong one in the new show called Fate, which might be around 12 or 14 minutes long. And it's a quartet of 4 kind of symphonic movements, you know? So obviously you're building something like that. You have a sort of a conceit, as they call it, a kind of architectural sensibility about the thing, how it would work and what it's like to be on the receiving end of it, of hearing it. And you know, what is it? And it's a love letter to people of your generation, basically, is what it is. But it's not a get well card, because it's looking directly at the world that's coming on and reflecting on the relationship between the generations as a result of that. And the tagline towards the end is something like, but the fix isn't in. It's not fatal, baby. It's fate. And it comes to this. Now that the gods have spoken, what will you do? And we answer that question every day. And that's what time it is. So yes, eventually, the architecture is very deliberate, very hortatory. Do you know the word hortatory?
No, actually, I don't.
It's the root word for to exhort, exhortation. It's a kind of prayerful plea for some kind of engagement. You know, it's not telling people what to do, but it's making a very strong case that, you know, people get ready, there's a train coming, that sort of thing. So I'm here in frickin' Boise, Idaho to do that. Don't ask me to explain that part. I'm not sure that's a good plan.
Yeah, so this is the second tour you guys are doing?
Oh no, we've been on the road maybe 6 distinct times.
Wow.
Yeah.
So is there any particular stories or moments that stand out from your time touring? Maybe there was a conversation or something that happened during a show that kind of moved you.
Oh God, there's all kinds of depending on the kind of nuance or category you have in mind. I mean, 2 come to mind very quickly. One of them is, so we did that brief tour I told you about, where we got the money. And we just kind of looked at each other and said, let's giddy up. I had all kinds of invitations to come down to Australia, New Zealand, and Tasmania. I just put them together and said, here's what we're going to do. I'm not going to come around and teach. I'm going to come around, we're going to bring some guitars, and we're going to do this down there. And like that, we put together a 26-city tour, okay? But we needed help. You can't do everything. No matter what you think, you know, even if you know how to do it all, you can't do it all. Not touring like this. So we needed help. Long story short, we got a young fella to join us, and he crowdfunded, because we said, we're not have no money. You know, it's all by bootstraps. So he crowdfunded, he got the money to join us, and he did. And the first 2 days were a disaster. I mean, he was leaving stuff in the luggage carousel. Like, he's supposed to be the roadie, right? He's supposed to be, as I said to him, 20 minutes out in front, man. That's where you got to be, you know? And he's just blowing it every chance he gets. So we sit down that night. Gregory says, like, he's doing this, like, take it easy. So I already took it easy. So here we are. I said, so basically, this is not working, man. I don't know why it's not working, but you don't look like you want to be here, and you don't look like you think this is a good idea, but you were wild about it 3 days ago. So you got to know yourself well enough to tell me, in the next 24 hours, it's got to turn around, or you got to go. It was really a rough moment. And the whole thing was like this, right? And you know what? He began to tell us a story of how he only beginning to realize how scared he was of older men. That's where the whole thing went. So we listened to him, you know, and he's weeping and all of that. And who knows where it came from? Like, I'm not here to tell the man's story, right? But anyway, it was there. And at the end of it, basically we said to him, okay, now the 3 of us know what's up, okay? Now nothing's going to change. You're still going to be with older men. But they want you to be here. You don't have to prove yourself. You just have to be here with us. From that moment forward, it was amazing. I mean, more than amazing. You just saw this guy just become redeemed in his own eyes, you know. He had a degree of worth and importance in the arrangement that he didn't think he ever had in his life. So who saw that coming? To the point where when we got towards the end and we got to a big city, we took him to a men's clothing store and brought the lady over and said, you know, trick him out. This guy needs to look real as good on the outside as he is on the inside. And so we completely decked him out. You know, he was looking very fine indeed, I must tell you. And he said, I don't look like me at all. I said, on the contrary, you finally do. You finally look like you. You look like a made man. So I'll never forget that. That's all a consequence of the Nights of Grief and Mystery. And the other one is very recent. So we're doing a gig in California, in Los Angeles. And for some reason, Los Angeles seems to like me. So the crowds are really good. And part of the live recording from Dark Roads comes from the last show that I'm describing to you. So it's a really immaculate recital hall with sound baffles hanging from the ceiling and teak wood on the walls. And oh, man. And you don't have to worry about the sound, you know. And here's what they got as part of the package when you rent the joint. They got a guy. I'm not sure what his job was, but he would sit there just off stage. And as you filed out of the green room and to go onto the stage, he's sitting there like somebody from Greek mythology. And he just looks at you and bows. He's a Chicano guy, you know, about probably 5'3" or 4", not about my size or a little smaller. And he would look right at you and he would just nod. And it was just this look of crazy affirmation, like whatever's about to happen, you know, God's in the house. Basically, that's what it was. And he would just give you this kind of, you know, thing. And as I walked past him the last time, I put my hand on top of his head so we could both get a blessing, you know. And he said to me, we know. And then I went out, fantastic show, came back, he's waiting for us, same look. And it's like the universe telling you, carry on, son, in the form of this guy from somewhere in Central America, and that was his gig. Grief and Mystery, baby.
Beautiful, beautiful.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I was curious about this. At the beginning of your first record, which is also titled Nights of Grief and Mystery, you say that Nights in Grief and Mystery are cognitive dissonance for everyone. What did you mean by that?
Yeah. Well, I think you know, actually. I think that's why you're asking me about it. Cognitive dissonance means, it doesn't mean confusion exactly, although confusion can ensue from it. But you get the dogs outside in the foyer. Now you can hear that too. Cognitive dissonance is you had a certain order to your understanding of life, right? Which you could reproduce in how you expressed yourself. Certain way you think things just go. They're bound to go this way. This is how life works. This is how it's built, etc. You don't wonder about it too much, but you drag it around a lot. Then something happens. You meet somebody, whatever it is. Could be romantic, could be occupational, you know, could be simply the light comes through the window in just such a way that you've never seen, whatever it is. And for a moment, at least, most things you thought were true are hanging by a thread. Okay. And if you're curious about your life, these moments really belong. But if you're really invested in your own take on things, these moments are catastrophic. Okay. So somewhere between belonging and catastrophe is dissonance of the cognitive kind. And the Nights of Grief and Mystery are an incarnation of the opportunity simply to think a different thought about what you've grown accustomed to. And the difference turns out to be very disheveling. In other words, I'm treating people like they're grown-ups. So it's not therapy. It's not trying to make sure you're okay at the end of the night. It's trying to make sure you're more so by the end of the night.
Yeah, what you've been sharing today, it does really sound like it's almost like you want people to take responsibility, and this kind of it's kind of to me there's a parallel between kind of the message that Jordan Peterson's been kind of saying and maybe why he's been so popular is he's had this message, and especially for men, of like kind of taking responsibility. And you've mentioned this before of like maybe this is an assignment, whatever the troubled times are, maybe they're an assignment. So it's almost like it feels like that's what you're saying. It's like, yeah, like there's a mess here, there's a mess here, there's something that's happening, there's these are difficult times, and it's like, what are you going to do about it? What are you going to do with it?
I don't know the comparison to Mr. Peterson myself. I mean, I should say, parenthetically at least, though I don't claim to really be too alert to the content of what he's about, but I'm obviously aware of his presence and consequence and the rest. And I'm just, I'm glad that he's taken on what he's trying to take on. How it goes is a different comment, but the fact that it's going, yeah, amen. Plus, he's a fellow Canadian, so good on him for that. Okay, but I wouldn't. I mean, I don't agree with the characterization that somehow I'm asking people to take responsibility. I don't know that I'm asking people to do anything.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think I'm that either. I don't think I'm that accommodating. It's not really asking. It's a little more of a lay down. It's a little more of a mic drop than that. It's we got a little bit of time, not much. We got a lot of wrong. We don't have a lot of choices. We don't have the luxury of you getting your shit together first, personally. Let's put it this way. You may get your shit together, you may not. You may, do a half-assed job of it. But the world doesn't need you. The world needs you to be human. It needs the full capacity of your humanity to appear. The world doesn't need more people. I mean, that's so obvious. But the world needs all the people that are here to be people, not just to take up room and, get themselves satisfied and suck their ayahuasca and all that other stuff. I mean, real-time dilemma. That's what we're talking about. Not childhood trauma and all that. Real-time, present tense dilemma. So, yeah, I don't think I'm asking. And it's a pushy damn thing to do, obviously, because nobody's asking you to relocate them into urgency land. But I think that is the consequence of the case that I'm making, that there is a relocation that's obligatory. We've tried taking care of ourselves, haven't we? I mean, what's the last 30 years been? But self-development, self-improvement, all the rest of it. I mean, there's some nobility to it, I suppose. But during that course of that self-improvement regime, just about everything's gotten worse. I just think the case is already made that this is not going to get it done. That the glaciers are simply not benefited by you getting your shit together.
Yeah, so you think it's like a selfishness thing? It's like we've been too self-absorbed, too self-entitled, too much about the self. Something to do with our identity being very limited and constricted.
Those things are all there, but I'm not a fan of accusing people of anything. I mean, I haven't met most people, have I? So, so we make our educated guesses best we can, trying to work backwards from the evidence. The evidence is that during the same time period at which the inner child was a big industry, and now trauma is a big industry, and the interior landscape is the fascinating landscape. That's the place you go to when the exterior landscape starting to melt on you. So what does it sound like? It sounds to me like the great grief bypass pretending to be the answer. So sorrow is the order of the day here, not being okay. It's not a time for being okay. Can you imagine looking at kids in the year 2035? 2035. Okay, these kids I'm talking about are not born yet, but they're being born now. Can you imagine looking him in the eye and saying, well, here's what I did when the shit truly started to come down. I went back to the good old LSD just to see how that would work out. I took some mood alters and went, a few really cool trips. And and I'm 17, listen to this shit. What am I thinking? As the world around me is melting and this idiot, in his 50s or 60s is bragging about how much self-development. See what I'm saying? The question is, what will it sound like to the people who are not born yet? Not whether it's self-indulgent or not, just how will it play when you got to look your grandchildren in the eye? I think that's a fairly good measure, to be honest.
Yeah, so I am curious about some of the things you are saying, like let's talk like trauma, for example, right? So if I have some kind of trauma and I'm doing some kind of work to process my trauma, to heal my trauma, to not pass along my trauma to my little kids, why would that not be, how would that not be a contribution to changing the world or making something better or taking responsibility?
Yeah, the math of the question makes a lot of sense. But the math of the question is predicated on this, that all the world is the sum total of all the individuals that make it up. That's the calculation that you just relied upon to say what you said. So the automaticness goes like this. If I'm working on myself and I'm vaguely successful at it, the world's bound to benefit. I say to you, what makes you think that translation's automatic? What makes you think that all the world is the sum total of the, excuse the language, the fuck-uppedness of the people that make it up? And if you reduce the fuck-uppedness, then the upside just automatically rises like cream. I mean, there's just no sign that that's how it goes. So there's a trauma industry now, right? Of course there is. It's big business, huge money to be had, and a lot of opportunity. It's going to sound harsh now. A lot of opportunity to set the world aside for the time being, because you were in harm's way at one point in your life, and you get a get out of jail card called trauma. Now, I'm not saying people use it that way. I'm saying one of the consequences of being absorbed at the level of your own trauma is the world tends to disappear. And if your assumption is that while the world disappears and you're working on yourself, the world will automatically and magically reappear once you've done that work. I mean, first of all, I don't think it works that way. And second of all, are we supposed to wait for you? I mean, we need all hands on deck here. So you're asking those of us who are not taking time out for the trauma thing to do what? While you are. Look, I know it sounds intolerant, okay? What you're hearing from me is something like this. There's a degree of urgency that comes with the fact that the clock is ticking in every way you can imagine. Maybe it's just not the time for trauma, okay? So then why is trauma such big news in a time that doesn't have the time for it? That we can't afford the time for it? Well, it doesn't surprise me at all that trauma is big news when you're already given up. You've already decided that the work's too vast, it's too late, it's too crazy, it's too, all that. And then you go to trauma to legitimize that sense of, hey, I'm out. It's not shocking. It's coincidental in the extreme.
Yeah. So I'm curious about what is it that translates and how pragmatically, what does it look like to do the work that life is asking of us? Not you, not necessarily you, but life is asking for us to do the work. Like, what does that look like pragmatically for those that might be listening? Some of the younger generations, they're wondering, how can they take responsibility? What can they actually do that will translate?
Look, anybody who answers the question in terms you asked it shouldn't really be listened to, in my humble opinion. Here's why. This is not a matter of the program. Somebody's got the program. Let's get the program. Let's meet the new boss. And maybe he's not the same as the old boss. See what I'm saying? This is part of the old strategy, that you got to have a plan, and you got to feel assured about it, and you got to know you're on the winning side before you take up the work. Just tell me what it looks like first, so I'm not signing on the dotted line for some bogus enterprise. See where that's coming from? It's like you want to get paid before you do the work. I want to know what I'm supposed to be doing first. So you can tell where I'm headed with this answer. Is maybe a time like this, one of the early casualties is the clarity of a, quote, plan. Maybe that doesn't belong. Maybe the question is not, what should you be doing? Maybe the question is, what have you been doing? Because that's not hypothetical anymore, is it? That's a matter of the record. So if you visit that instead, what have you undertaken in the name of a better day? And what kind of better day do you think ensued from it? And is it possible you're off the mark? Is it possible that your definition of a better day comes from never having seen one? Yeah. So what if we assemble in the town square? I mean, as an understanding now, what if we assemble in the town square, not tens of millions of people? I don't know, 27 people who don't really know each other, who mysteriously got the same message at the same time and showed up, but they didn't know why. But they listened. And that, because they tried not listening, and they know how that worked out. So they listened. So they start saying, you got them. So what did you make of that? Well, I just came. Well, who's the boss? Well, maybe there's no boss in the old sense of the term. Maybe there's no guru. I mean, if we've learned anything, God help us, in the last 50 years about gurus in America, is that, the gurus are not very good for America. And America's not very good for the gurus. They don't work together very well, right? Okay, so maybe that's not what we're talking about, charismatic leading types, I mean, God, you just had a president that had a lot of those qualities, So I think the question, although it's very understandable what you've asked me, but it's a question that's a dead end. Show me, don't tell me, show me. Well, wait a second. I don't have to earn your absolute trust, and that's not the game. I don't have to be that guy so that all your doubts are allayed and now you know who to follow. Maybe the time of following like that has been tried. So maybe I'm not talking about, falling behind. Maybe I'm talking about something like this. Let's begin with the poverties, shall we? Not begin with the promise of success. And that's why I said, what have you done? Because nobody has to guess about what they have done. They just have to be really candid with themselves. I learned this, by the way, not in any kind of social justice diatribe situation. I learned this in the death trade. I'm sitting beside people who are dying, who don't get a second chance, who don't get to turn the clock back, who don't get to click their heels 3 times and say there's no place like home. See? They're heading out. And they can't slow it down. So you know what's happening, right? The notion that it's too late for most of the things they were counting on is coming around. And some part of them is turning into an adult, really for the first time. Because too late is grown-up stuff. Yeah, you don't get to negotiate with too late. No, you only get certain time in with your kids when they're kids. You didn't do it, you're not going to do it when they're in their 20s, no matter what you think. Feel bad all you want. Talk about how busy you were all you want, but it's gone. Okay, well, there's a lot of things that are gone right now. So as I say in the show, you can tell the kids it's not too late if you want them to vote for you. But you can't tell them that if you respect them. So then how do you mobilize in a time that's too late for a lot of things? Well, that's why you called me, because you have a sense that maybe that's what I'm doing. Well, you're not wrong. So I'm answering the question that you're asking me by doing what I'm doing. I'm not saying anybody else should get a rock and roll band together and try to change the world with what they're saying from the stage. I'm not saying that's the best form to do it. But I'm saying I'm not a one-trick pony either. I've done a few things. I'll probably do a few more if I'm granted a little time, you know. But like I said at the outset, they say that by the time you hit your mid-60s, you're supposed to be done, right? And you're supposed to be lapping up the consequences of what you did. It's not working out for me. So now I'm answering the question again. What should I be doing given all this? Well, there's no should. I am doing it. I'm doing something, right? I'm making these pleas. I'm trying to make these things lucid and available to people who are inclined to hear. People say to me, do a lot of so-called people of color, not my phrase, but a popular phrase, do they come to what you do? I said, no. Don't you feel bad about that? Not at all. Well, don't you feel that you're missing a huge part of the... I said, I'm not missing anybody. I'm not aiming at anybody. It's not a demographic contest. And look at me. If you're a black person, why would you come to anything I have to say? So for the moment, who do I have in mind? Answer is people who look like me. Believe me, there's enough of them. Right? I don't need to feel bad because somebody who doesn't look like me doesn't come around. Don't they have their own? Shouldn't they? Okay, so I'm not one size fits all, you see. This doesn't trouble me in the least. I've got enough pleas to make to people who share my ancestral history and my DNA. That'll keep me busy for the duration.
Yeah, I'm not going to try to summarize what you're saying. I'll allow it to be open-ended because I feel there's like that aliveness. And that's what I'm getting personally is a sense of aliveness and being on the present moment, being on the edge of what's happening now and being very awake and alive to it and viscerally just feeling what life is asking of you from your, what the infinite is asking from your, your personal perspective, where you are and your experience. And, taking the aliveness, I want to tie that back into coming back to death a little bit. And I know we're getting a little short on time, but maybe I could ask one or two questions in regards to death. And you've had a lot of experience working with the dying, and through this process, you've got to witness certain patterns and ways of being that people inhabit as they get close to death or they start to become conscious of, oh, I'm actually dying. Would you say that what you got to witness through your work with palliative care was kind of like the average person's response to death? And in that sense, it what you're saying is it's very applicable, it's very relevant to the average person, because this is probably the response that the average person would have. But I'm wondering do you think that these patterns would hold for a very dedicated spiritual practitioner or monastic, somebody who lives their life in a way where death is always held close?
That's a good question, and there's a lot in it. The first thing I'd say is, and this probably won't surprise you, I try to remember if I met an ordinary average person. I can't recall one right now. I'm not saying everybody's blisteringly unique, because if that's true, why are you and I talking? Because who could possibly understand what we're saying if they're not us? So that the whole thing's nonsense about, particular individuals and all the rest. So it's not a continuum. I'm saying that I was in the redemption business when I worked in the death trade. There was something miraculous that was ongoing. But the miracle was very ordinary. It wasn't spectacular. It wasn't the, time stopping, the sky opening up and some mystery hand reaching in. No, that's not mysterious. That's unnatural. Miracles are naturally occurring things. They belong in the architecture, right? So most people came on my watch, most people came to their dying in the way that they lived. So now, if you lived in a death-phobic culture and you didn't get much instruction at all, you saw very, very few examples of what it looked like to live the thing out, you see, to live in the presence of your dying instead of in spite of it. Well, what are you going to draw on when it's your turn? You're going to draw on what you saw, and most importantly, what you didn't see. So if that's ordinary, yep, I saw that over and over and sadly over and over again. And it didn't have to be that way, but it usually was. So then you realize if people die in the manner of their living, what you got to do if you want to try to be of help for them is do something about their manner of living. Not wait until their manner of dying becomes a foreclosure, you know. Give them a chance early on by asking an awful lot of them and promising very little. That's my gig. You know, I'm the reverse of the politician who wants you to vote for him. I don't promise you hardly anything at all, and I ask an awful lot, and then you either walk through the door or you don't. And it's not for me to say whether you should or whether you shouldn't, but you can tell from the way I'm carrying myself if I think you should or not. But not should from a moral finger wagging point of view. Should because other people are watching, man. Other people are watching how you die. Okay, you are their place where they're getting a PhD in life. So what do you propose that they learn from your manner of dying? There. Now you're talking about something that matters. Well, what good is that going to do you? Well, it's a little late for you to ask for a payday in how you die. But your manner of death could be somebody else's payday. They get a chance to see something that borders on being the real thing, you see. Then you're a culture worker in your dying. Now, the second part of your question about, people who've lived a life. Well, they become exactly the person I just told you about. They become, just by their little example, they become a rumor that it doesn't have to be the miserable, fear-driven thing that it so often is. It's not automatic. In other words, terror does not belong to dying. It's imported and Velcroed on, but it doesn't belong there. But it's a huge act of learning to let that shit go and to realize that you're dying unto someone else now. This is not your dying. It's entrusted to you. So how shall you care for it? And how shall you be? And so I'm back to, the very beginning of the show. I say something like, so how shall we be? And what shall we say now that the call and the summons and the plea has gone out? It's better that we make as though many a thing hangs there in the rafters above or hangs in the balance below, as if how we are with each other, that's how the Lord's a chance going to be with us. As if what we say this very evening is going to bring in the saints and the ancients of days, or it's going to bring down the darkness and the rough gods. I'm not keeping secrets up here. I'm laying it out. I'm saying, I think this is what's at stake. And don't think globally, think tonight. See, tonight. Tomorrow night in Boise, Idaho. That's what I'm coming down with. Coming down off the mountain with that. How's it going to go? I have no idea. Is there going to be a lot of takers? I doubt it very much. So doesn't that dispirit you? Fuck no. Why would I be dispirited about something that's going to happen anyway? No, I'm not in the metrics game. I'm not trying to rack up the hits. We don't have any hits. We have pleas and summons and calls. You answer it, you don't answer it. Bad timing, you didn't hear it this time. You're busy with your girlfriend, whatever it is. Okay, maybe there isn't a next time, who knows? But there's this time. And so the responsibility is you as fully as you can, you inhabit this time. And man, that's what I learned in the death trade. I know so many people who are dead, who would trade you and me, all our problems, like that, for the chance to breathe again, one more breath. That shit helps to know that.
Yeah, I feel like this is a powerful place to end, but I do have this one question, and this might just ruin everything.
Okay.
This question might ruin everything, but I'll take my chance with it and see how it lands with you. So, we know that people have a nearly impossible time accepting the truth of their death, and this has been reflected in many writings. Probably most notably in Ernest Becker's The Denial of Death. Is it possible that maybe, just maybe, we can't accept the idea of our death because deep down, what we truly are knows that it never dies?
I think if we knew, this is your word now, if we knew that there's some aspect of us that never dies, it's hard to imagine that part of you would be arguing and and arm wrestling about that very question. I mean, if you really knew it, why would you get in a pissing match with anybody about anything, especially about whether or not anything endures your death? I don't think that's the way it would work. I think the understanding that something never dies itself wouldn't die either. But it would tell stories. It wouldn't make arguments, like I said at the beginning. But, the idea that there's something about us that never dies is a little bit tricky formulation. Because with all due respect now, and I don't pretend to know you at all, but it would be not an easy case to make that there's something so fundamentally fabulous about you that it should last for eternity. It's just not an easy case to make,
Depends what you mean, what we mean by me.
That's what I'm saying.
My body and my ego is definitely not going to last. Yeah. That's definitely not going to last. It's going to dissolve real soon.
Right. So this is a big question. Is there's something of us that doesn't die? I think all of us dies. And then there's more. I don't think there's a hangover, if you will. I think the whole thing dies. I mean, I don't know, but you asked me to guess. So I'm guessing the whole thing dies and then the story continues. Now, it doesn't continue in the same way that it did because everything died. Okay? So you don't get to continue, but life gets to continue. And maybe somewhere in there, life continues employing you to do it. But you're not continuing, but life is continuing, which if you really had to choose, it was either or. I'd hope you choose that life continues, not you. And of course, that's the plea I'm making. Now, if I'm wrong about this and there's something about you that continues, man, it must be very crowded, wherever the hell Central Command pulls this thing together, that, nothing really dies. It just keeps going and going and going. And it makes you wonder, so is there such a thing as new people? Or have we already been and done and been and done and been? And if that's true, Jesus, where's all the accumulated experience go? Isn't this supposed to result in some kind of upside? Why is it? Why do things go so haywire?
We keep forgetting
this over and over again. Huh?
We keep forgetting. We keep forgetting.
Okay, so one of the things I'm doing is remembering out loud.
Yeah.
There it is.
Yeah. I mean, this has been another fascinating exploration, and there's so much wisdom. I'm really looking forward to listening to this again. I did want to kind of, this is probably going to take a couple of weeks before it's edited and released, but maybe you want to share kind of some of the upcoming shows you have coming up in October and anything else you want to plug in regards to Nights of Grief and Mystery.
Oh man, I plugged it. So, I mean, I got nothing to add except I don't have the itinerary memorized in any way at all. I know we're going out at least 3 times, maybe 4 times in your country, starting tomorrow night here. And whatever it is, September the 18th or something. And then for some reason, your West Coast thinks I'm a decent idea. So there's a lot of draw out there. So we're going up and down. I think there's 20-something shows just on the West Coast.
Wow.
Yeah. So, I mean, it's very encouraging, but I'm not reading all the reviews, I'm glad that people are willing to give us the gift of their evening, and we see if we can reciprocate, and all is said and done, we're guests, right? So I'm not rattling the cage. I'm not banging on the bars with a tin can, I'm saying something in the order of, as an outsider, And occasionally an outsider's point of view should be welcome. Not an opinion, just something that they've been entrusted with. And maybe the real stuff doesn't really obey citizenship and boundaries and borders and this kind of thing. And maybe if it's in the world, then maybe it can lay a claim to all of us in some fashion. And, timing is God's middle name, it seems to me. So if the timing is right and you happen to be just vulnerable enough not to be sure of yourself, we could be a good night out for you.
Yeah, I have a little grief. When I looked at the schedule, I didn't see you guys coming to New York City. So I don't know if there wasn't enough interest there or what it was, but it would have been nice to kind of be in your presence of the show.
Well, it won't be this fall, but the same, I was just did a book reading in Toronto on Sunday night. A lot of people came up to me after and said the same thing. What's with? There's nothing in Toronto, nothing in Southern Ontario. Not now, but we're trying to get our bad selves together. And then, you want to have your shit wired down when you go to New York City. Isn't it true?
Yep.
Okay, then. So consider ourselves tuning up and get ready, because I suspect we're going to be there sooner than you think.
Beautiful, beautiful. I look forward to it. And if you're here, I will be in attendance for sure. Stephen, thanks a lot for your time. Thanks a lot for coming on here and sharing your wisdom, and wishing you all the best, and you're on the tour and on the coming shows, and look forward to speaking to you again.
Thank you, bro. Thank you for your time too.
Yes. Thank you.
Take care of yourself. All right. Bye-bye now.